Evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight for our first virtual salon. BLP authors celebrate Samuel Beckett. I'm Erica Goldman, publisher and editorial director of Bellevue Literary Press. You may wish to open your Q&A window, which you can find access to down at the bottom of the Zoom screen panel. This pandemic year has been terrible for so many, but as we emerge into the hopefulness of spring, we're looking around us with gratitude that we're still here and thriving, thanks to our wonderful authors and our generous board and individual donors. We hope you'll continue to help us publish the work of remarkable writers, two of whom are with us tonight, and I'm pleased to introduce them to you now. There's a lot to say about these brilliant, accomplished people, but I'll keep my remarks brief because we have a very full program for you tonight. Amanda Dennis is the author of Her Here, a debut novel recently published by BLP. She joins us tonight from Paris, where she is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature and Creative Writing at the American University of Paris. Her scholarly book on Samuel Beckett's work, Beckett and Embodiment, Body, Space, Agency, is due out in August as part of Edinburgh University Press's Other Beckett's series. Michael Coffey, the former co-editorial director of Publishers Weekly, is the author of 3 books of poetry, a nonfiction book on baseball, the co-editor of The Irish in America, a companion book to the PBS series, and a debut collection of stories that we published, The Business of Naming Things. Since leaving Publishers Weekly, he has focused on engaging the work of Samuel Beckett, and his Samuel Beckett is Closed was published by OR Books. Wendy Smith, our moderator, is a cultural critic, book reviewer, and committed Beckett enthusiast. She is also the author of real-life drama, The Group Theater and America, 1931 to 1940, which is available in paperback from Vintage. We'll start with a short reading from each of our BLP authors' books and then move into the panel discussion. You'll see that links to these books on bookshop.org will display in the Q&A panel if you'd like to purchase them, along with links to our donation page. Amanda?
Hi, thanks so much, Erica, and thanks for having me here to talk about Beckett and contemporary literature. I'm really looking forward to this evening. I'm going to read to you from the second half of the novel, so I'll give you just a brief kind of orientation to situate you. The novel is about a woman living in Paris, Elena, who gets a rather bizarre task. She's supposed to look for a missing girl, missing 6 years before the novel opens, by looking through journals that she left behind when she was living in Thailand, where she lived right up to her disappearance. So at this point in the novel, Elena has already found herself really involved in this project, and she's started to take on the characteristics of the woman she's searching for. So she's already sort of losing a little bit her sense of discrete identity. And in the passage I'm going to read, she's trying to figure out what happened to Ella, and she's written most of the story. She's reconstructing a narrative, but she needs something else. So she takes herself for a weekend in Normandy to just be by the sea, to try to channel some of what Ella was seeing in Thailand and to try to understand her better. And she thinks she's in control in this section, but she might not be. On the Alabaster Coast, 2 hours from Paris by train, the erosion of chalk cliffs make turquoise patches in the water. I will know that it is Normandy, of course, and not an island in the Andaman Sea. But I will feel close to her there, to what she lived, to the color of her sea. The train is crowded. No one checks my ticket. After changing at Rouen, it is more peaceful, fewer people. The air carries hints of grass and salt, and the roar of cities fades. Fields of wheat and green linen stretch to the sky, and finally it is quiet enough to hear her again. Ella. I have booked 4 nights in a cottage by the sea, in the spare room of a woman who grows irises on her thatched roof and tends a garden teeming with roses and hydrangea. She serves lavish breakfasts and tells me about the walking paths and tides, erratic and forceful in the region. Hot-colored roses in the morning fog remind me of the English countryside my mother loved. As a child, she spent her summers in Dover. When the tide is out, I walk along the vast table of sands and slippery rocks. The cliffs are vertical drops of white that separate the village from the sea. Steep stone steps lead down to the beach, and at high tide, right into the water. Down until the body is light, lifted by the waves. But the sea in the morning is hardly there. The steps lead into a lunar landscape of tide-battered rocks and rippled sands and fields of seaweed like thick strands of hair. In the distance, men scavenge for shellfish or whatever the tide has left behind. The fog burns off slowly. Then the sun filters into forest paths and lights the fields. The tide rushes in an hour later every day. The jungle paths are so deep and lush, I can almost believe I am elsewhere. Except then a clearing comes where noble Norman cows are grazing. The paths are damp and buzzing with insects. Each day I alternate among forest, cliffs, and coast, carrying Ella's green journal and my notebook of possible endings. The innkeeper worries that the weather is too warm, but it is cooler here than in Thailand, so every degree moves me closer to Ella. Encountering even one other walker takes me out of the spell I'm weaving, so I press deeper into the forests, away from the paths and farther into the void of sands at low tide. At noon, most days, a blankness overtakes me. It's different from a loss of memory, just the cost of becoming absorbed in her. It means that something is working. I am out on the sands. The sun is high. There are no shadows. When I come to, I'm sitting in a tidal pool, wet through and very cold. The light is gold and slanting at hard angles. This is intentional. I am in control. I walk her walk and swim with her body. Yes, I embody her. The ink runs out of my pen, and it is in such humble, subtle ways that one finds one's way into another's skin. I can feel her thrill and devastation. The water line at low tide is far from the cliffs, and I wade in the shallow pools, my sandals slipping on the sharp rocks. Ella will race the tide. We must wait for it. We do. When it comes, it is very fast, but we see it and stay ahead, our lungs burning as we run, adrenaline charging through us. At the very end, we slip on the rocks, but there is still time. We pull ourselves up the stone steps, then dangle our feet in the sea to congratulate ourselves as the water swirls in little breakers below us. The water is green, and there is no more sun. The air turns yellow, the way it does before a storm. She dives. I hear her splash. I tell her to be careful. She bobs her head and laughs, her hair plastered to her shoulders, then ducks beneath the waves. The water turns greener in the changing light. Terrified, I call her name. She doesn't emerge. The water is freezing, a shock to the whole body. Salt stings my eyes as I grope wildly, cutting myself on the jagged edges of rocks. I dive lower, then charge up for air. The surface gets choppier. Currents threaten to dash us against the cliffs. I can't breathe, and I'm afraid. And I must tell myself, the cold isn't real. None of this is real. A flaw of this body I must use to discover you. Then, suddenly, it is morning, and the innkeeper hums as she sets out coffee, fruit, and croissants with salted butter. She goes out to the garden to feed the roses. Birds are singing. My bag is packed beside me, ready for the train. There are scratches on my arms, and I smell of unfamiliar lavender soap. Stop there. Turn it over to you, Michael.
And first of all, thank you, Erica, again, for your continued great efforts at bringing literature into the market. It's a very challenging thing to do, and you do it heroically and beautifully. So thank you. And bonjour, Amanda. I'm going to read from the first story in my book that Erica published, The Business of Naming Things. It's called Moon Over Quabbin. It's the shortest story in the book. The woman is in Iowa now, I hear. She moved there with her husband shortly after, and now she sees. She has my eyes, a cobalt blue, opaque as marbles. She blinks them. When I see the woman in Iowa, I see those eyes. They aren't mine, literally. They are the eyes of my dead son. I saw myself reflected in them for so many hours. Thousands, could it be? My face blued, my hair orbing back, gray and wild, deeper into Matthew's irises. What would I see in those eyes, in her face? I'll never know. I'll never know her. She has children of her own, I like to think. And of course, there are problems. I can only imagine and must. There are always problems with children. Not everyone has such problems as I have had, but still there are problems enough for us all, and she'll have hers, even if now she can see and doesn't have that problem anymore. Most of these troubles she and her husband will surmount. The bad falls, the whooping cough scare, the man who almost talks her boy into a Greyhound bus, but for the intervention of a driver. And then his jailing for possible arson, which brings his mother from Iowa back here to Amherst, where her boy has gone to school, her blue eyes now wavering toward middle age, paler now, giving a little light, as if ice had melted in a blue drink. She would look at her shoes, waiting to see her son, and I might see him too. A man will come through and call her name, Mrs. White. The man is a counselor, he says, attached to the sheriff's office. He tells Mrs. White he feels her boy is innocent of any involvement in the fire. As he talks, she can only stare. He is a warm man with large features and hands. The woman bets that all his attachments are large, and she flushes with shame at such a thought, at such a time, as do I. He tells her it was a political thing. Everything's political, she blurts out. He tells her that some kids are after burning Amherst Hall, and she wonders at this Irish grammar. Jeffrey Amherst, the small thing about smallpox blankets. She knows, she remembers, the decimated Indians. He thinks to introduce himself. I'm Mr. Green. Mrs. White can sense muscles shifting in Mr. Green's chest as he thinks and breathes and speaks, and as he listens for her. A political thing is all she can say, touching again the words he has given her. Finally, she hugs Mr. Green. He himself has nothing more to say. Against his wide chest, she can hear the deep soundings of his heart, thudding like drums in a cavern filled with water and stones. Behind it, she can hear the coursing of his blood. She wants to sleep there, right there in his blood. Before moving to Iowa, Mrs. White, Vera, lived in a town that is now underwater, the town of Dana, east of where I am now. The state bought up 4 towns altogether, offering market prices for homes and businesses, raising as much as they saw fit of what was left before the damming of the Quabbin River. In a year's time, the stopped river would fill the valleys with water, destined for the suburbs of Boston. Mrs. White out there in Iowa would often imagine their basement back home, the one now solid with sludge, a small packed room at the bottom of a vast lake. At other times, it would suit her to think of their old family rec room, its paneled walls and dry bar, and slate pool table sitting unchanged in a cube of clear lake water. Along the walls, the ends of large pipes visible through fractured cinder blocks, like little portholes into solid subterranean black. This, the rare, strange lake with a bed of sunken sewer systems and leach fields. Often Mrs. White would think, this is an image of her mind. Sewers, underground, plumbing, hidden pipeworks, many of them going to a river bottom that's no longer a river. It's in a bigger body now. Mrs. White would be reminded of her son, who whiled away so much of his childhood in that basement, puttering alone amid his unfathomable fantasies, scheming with his friends, sneaking cigarettes and girly magazines, his mysterious, inevitable passage from bright sweet boy to the dark station of teenagehood, transpiring there beneath ground and now in her memory, under 200 feet of reservoir water. You see, I think of myself as her sometimes. This is my problem. I find myself speaking of the Iowa woman as if she were myself and vice versa. I make her come back to my town, the one underwater. I make her from here. It's all confused and dizzying. I find the third person more comfortable. It's easier for me to say, often she would think, this is an image of her mind, than to say, often I would think, this is an image of my mind, even though it's the same thing. But it is I who thinks often of the Quabbin Reservoir, since we lost Matthew, that vacation in Italy, roadside bandits, a gunshot, his forehead. I see myself walking along the reservoir bottom, and there meeting the ghosts of the 4 communities, walking, more like wading, from town to town, up the long hill to Enfield, now a dark mound alive with bubbles, over to Greenwich, where the Jackson barn still wavers erect, and on to Prescott, where I wrecked our car on a culvert I still don't see. It's lonely down here, but somehow peaceful. Between the towns of Enfield and Dana, I see that woman whose eyes are my son's, are mine. What are you doing underwater, I ask. And she rises out of sight in a shaft of captured air and light to the surface. I have tried to make something, anything at all, of my boy's passing. I have told his life story to myself over and over, starting from his conception on Pequot Hill one gorgeous May dawn, through his early troubles with his feet, to his Little League triumphs and his father's pride and his first girlfriend. And all the rest, those teenage years right up to the shooting, and nothing coheres. But it's not only my boy's story that doesn't come together, but everything else as well. My own story, my life as a mother, my parents, or my sister's life. What I can grasp is what is left of Matthew, his eyes in the Iowa woman's head, his heart in the chest of the man from Amherst, his kidneys in that boy from the valley, whose name I know. I imagine they'll all meet sometime. I imagine I'll meet them all myself too, in time. But as I say, I just imagine it. But when the moon is full and bright in the sky, that one moon that is everyone's moon, I know it tugs on the tides of my boy, his humors, wherever they are. And as they lean together in one direction to its pull, like the weeds under Quabbin, leaning, I know that each is aware of the other, of itself, of their original self. And as they move toward the light, wherever they are, At times like this, I know the moon and the water and what it all means. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And over to you, Wendy.
Thank you, Michael and Amanda. Thank you, Erica. Michael and Amanda, thank you so much for your readings. I love to hear authors read their work. It always gives you a whole new feeling about them. So thanks to you both. Before we start the panel, I'm just going to say it's entirely unsurprising that Erica wanted to host a salon on Samuel Beckett for supporters of Bellevue Literary Press, and that among her authors she found two who not only claimed Beckett as an inspiration for their fiction, but who were Beckett scholars as well. Bellevue belongs to a proud tradition of small independent publishers with taste, courage, and conviction that also includes 3 presses on 3 continents who supported Samuel Beckett when he was an obscure, impoverished writer no commercial publisher would touch. When Beckett began to write in French, the decision that propelled him into a period of furious creativity after World War II, he found a champion in Paris in Les Éditions de Minuit. Éditions de Minuit published his work in French beginning with Malloy, first in the great trilogy that also includes Malone Dies and The Unnameable, books of spaces, silences, and anti-narratives, to shamelessly steal Michael's wonderful phrase about them, that remade people's notions of what literature could be and do. That was in 1951, 2 years before Waiting for Godot announced that Beckett intended to do the same with the theater, completely remake it with a play that appeared to go nowhere, but yet spoke powerfully and eloquently of the human condition. Godot was the talk of the international theatrical world, but it was so radically new that it was turned down by several major American publishers. However, Barney Rossett at Grove Press knew genius when he saw it. Beginning in 1954, Grove published all of Beckett's plays and fiction as part of a bold publishing program that also included Jack Kerouac and every other major beat writer. Grove also fought and won landmark cases against censorship with its publications of Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and William S. Burroughs' Naked Lunch. Beckett's prose works were published in London by John Calder, whose adventurous press also introduced English readers to the giants of the post-war European avant-garde, from Marguerite Duras to Eugène Ionesco. This is the heritage that Bellevue Literary Press claims and honors with our panel tonight. I urge you to consider making a donation and continuing to support their wonderful work. Thanks. So, Michael and Amanda, I would say, and I'll be interested to see if you agree, neither of you really echoes Beckett's prose style, but you're both scholars who care deeply about his work. And Amanda, I know that when you were writing your dissertation on Beckett, you were also working on Her Here sort of as a break from the scholarly work. I certainly can see not the style, but some very Beckettian concepts in Her Here. Did you feel his influence kind of seeping into your fiction as you were working on it?
As I was working on the fiction, not at all. I was convinced that the fiction had nothing to do with the scholarly work. It was the thing that I did kind of, not on the side, but maybe before and after the dissertation. That said, while I was writing, I would, as I was working on Her Here, there were days when I felt like my prose needed a boost. It needed to feel more alive. Something needed to kind of kick into place, and I'd copy out lines of Beckett just to get that kind of rigor into my language. And it was kind of after Her Here was published, or right about the time it was being published a few months ago, that I started to actually think about the links, because they're there. I just think they were working subliminally or subconsciously as I was writing. And I'm thinking about Malloy, which perhaps has to be my favorite of the prose works. I say that very hesitantly, but there's just a beauty in the lyricism that really gets me every time. And Malloy, of course, is a detective story. It's a story where the cerebral, more rational character, Moran, is looking for the more sensuous Malloy. And of course, in Her Here, you have the kind of more cerebral Elena looking for the kind of highly passionate, sensuous Ella. and you know, of course, they're very, very different. I don't want to insist too much on the comparison, but I do think there is something there. I'll just add one more thing before I close, and that's this idea, because I think it was also so present in the reading that Michael just did, but it's the slipperiness of identity in Beckett that interests me a lot as a writer and as a scholar. It's something I work on in my scholarship as well, and I'm thinking of scenes in Malone Dies where the narrator talks about slipping into his character to sort of know something, because this is Malone, of course, is making up characters as he waits for death, and so I think that ability to sort of really move into another body, another mind, another sensibility, and explore there is something that's really fascinating to me about Beckett's work. So it's not surprising that I picked up a little bit of it as I was writing.
I can see, and you've lobbed me a ball to toss to Michael, which I had intended to do anyway. Thank you, Michael. I know, because you told me, that you wanted to read this particular story because, and I'm going to quote you, what makes Beckett unique and is very central to his appeal and the interest in his work is its fundamental indeterminacy. The who now, where now, what now element in all his work. And yes, I certainly see that. Can you talk a little bit about how that, you know, what you see those connections as being in Moon over, sorry, I'm going for a short title, Moon over Quabbin.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I've been reading Beckett a long time, just enjoying the beautiful language and the formal rigor and the humor, and many of the blasted landscapes are just so fascinating to look at, not to mention the beauty of many of the plays. But recently I've begun to think that this indeterminacy that is throughout Beckett is what is the key to his, not his timelessness, but his continuous timeliness. That, and by indeterminacy, I mean, he's not really telling you a lot of things about where you are, when you are, who you are. Identity is very slippery. Gender is kind of ambiguous in many ways. You know, these Vladimir and Estragon standing around, they don't know if it's Friday or Saturday, it might be Monday or Tuesday. And it's kind of everywhere. So it's sort of comic in a way, but I think the power of it is that it insists on an interpretive engagement by the theater goer or the reader, that you're not given a whole package here and you're not reading a period piece and just sort of glorying in the details of what life was like in 19th century London or something, but rather what life is like abstracted from all locales in all times. And I think he did it purposefully. He was worked by subtraction and took out a lot of things that might identify a place or a person or a time. Mm-hmm. As a result, you come to it and you bring your own person, your own place, and your own time. And so, as Amanda well knows, I mean, the Beckett industry is just kind of booming. There are books being published, very good books with new angles all the time. I was just looking through a recent Journal of Beckett Studies, and there's something on all essays on COVID isolation, disability performance, gender formation, nostalgia and technology, and the alt-right, repetition in politics. And this just happens twice a year in that particular journal. It is always refreshing itself. So I didn't realize until tasked with like reading something from Business of Naming Things that was kind of influenced by Beckett, that the indeterminacy of that whole story, which I pity in a way people who were just hearing it for the first time because it sounds confused and you don't know where you are. But that's what's in the story, is that the woman narrating it doesn't know if she's talking about herself or this other woman or her son. And, you know, body itself is kind of distributed in certain ways, like this dead son's body has been sent around in organ donation, basically. But you can read Malloy or you can read some of the Beckett plays and you will see identity similarly distributed or dispersed. And you have a character trying trying to kind of put it back together maybe, but never so successfully. So that's kind of what the way Beckett has affected me, I'm beginning to realize. And much of my work has really had a lot of indeterminacy in it.
And Amanda, you wrote an essay about Beckett's, about the unnameable called Radical Indecision, which is a little bit different from indeterminacy, but I think I certainly see, I saw when I read that essay so much of, so many connections with her here in terms of just the sort of the sense of sort of tunneling and moving through an identity into another one, was quite fascinating. You've also said that you've been wisely advised to avoid imitating Beckett because his style cannot be imitated, and it's only the unwary would do it. But you have written that in terms of craft, what reading Beckett closely and writing about him taught me is to cut away everything that's not alive in the writing, to leave the silences the reader can enter, which I think sort of speaks to Michael's point about just indeterminacy, leaving room for the reader to decide about things. That's, I love this phrase. It's from Beckett that I learned to sculpt silence out of language, to leave room for resonance and for different versions of meaning. Again, very much like what Michael was saying. Is that something, did Beckett bring that to literature, do you think? Is that, or perhaps just make it something more powerful in the world of literature?
Yeah, I think so. I really like what Michael was saying about the indeterminacy and how that becomes a kind of, and how that welcomes contemporary issues like, things like climate change, disability studies, gender studies, things that are very much in debate in our contemporary moment. They're ways of sort of finding these controversies already in Beckett. I think the word that comes to mind for me, I think, is resonance. And when I look at a Beckett text, whether it's a play or whether it's prose, there are these sentences that really sort of enliven the imagination. They're incredibly specific and precise, and yet they resonate. They have this emotional force that I find so compelling. And I think, Wendy, I may have mentioned this to you, but when I started reading Beckett seriously as a graduate student, I was already writing fiction. And I was a bit of a flowery writer, if you can imagine. As
a sway of Proust, as I remember.
Yes, exactly. And I was immersed in Proust, and I was reading the whole recherche, and I was completely wrapped up in it. I was kind of under the spell, entranced. And I loved Proust. I loved reading it, and it started to come out in my writing. That kind of thing where you're reading so intensively that you start to mimic it unknowingly. And I started reading Beckett because I knew of him as a minimalist, and so I thought, well, this will be a corrective to my flowery Proust style. And so that was how I started reading Beckett more intensively. And I think that I got a lot more from Beckett than simply a kind of muscularity of prose. But I do think that I think what Beckett does as a writer is to sort of take away anything that's unnecessary and really leave the hardcore, the bones, the things that resonate there. And I think that's such a powerful thing to read. And so I think it's a worthy thing to try to imitate, even if it's hard to do it. Yeah.
Michael, I remember you quoting Beckett, and I don't remember the context, but someone referred to his work as abstraction, and he said, not abstraction, subtraction, which I thought was wonderful. Yet, you yourself wrote about this quite a bit. Beckett was consistently engaged with the issues of his times, not just during World War II when he was a member of the resistance and had to flee for his life, but later in life he wrote a play for Václav Havel. He was very much a defender of writers' rights and of just in general of people who were persecuted. It's not what people first think of, but I wonder if you can talk about why, as you once wrote, the world keeps intruding in Beckett.
Yeah, I mean, he did a couple of public things that made him recognizably political and caring about things. And I think his biographer, Jim Knowlson, said basically Beckett was left-wing. But in his work, I mean, for years, the traces of historical event and place and incident and war and tragedy were pretty much, sanded out of it, abstracted, subtracted, very vaguened, as he used the term vagan, V-A-G-U-E-N. And it's complicated to explain, and many people have done it in different ways, but Beckett's reputation kind of endured this universalizing after the war and for the next 15 or 20 years, where to have Beckett really having traces of the Holocaust or the Algerian War or the Irish Civil War, three very difficult things that he lived through and even more, was to somehow, those were complex issues, especially in France, both the Holocaust and the Vichy regime and what went on in the torture of French citizens in Algeria. Very difficult. So he was sort of held up as talking about universal man, not life in France. And in Ireland, they had all kinds of problems with Sam Beckett, the Anglo-Irish Protestant, whose father was a wealthy, contractor and whose mother's family came from grain merchants. They didn't quite identify with Beckett back in that time. But now, in the last 15 years, the historicizing of Beckett has taken sway. It's a new generation of scholars, really, and it's all there. And it's led to some beautiful books of essays. So, just reading a book now, which is about, Beckett and climate change. And it's taking Happy as the example where, Winnie is sitting, lodged in a mound of sand with a parasol that under the bright light starts to smoke. And so it's
great effect.
Yeah. And so that seemed like a pretty abstract play for many years. And now it's found its issue. And Endgame has found its own issues as well, which are now contemporary. So, it's even like COVID. Those guys, Ham and Clover, are stuck there. Outside it's death, they say. Nature has forgotten us. So.
Yep. No, I see. And I think I actually wanted to ask you both this, but Amanda, I'll start with you. Because you have noted that scholars have recently begun to address the implications of Beckett's work in the age of climate change, as Michael noted, the relevance of this sort of ethos of endurance in the aftermath of a catastrophe. Do you see, as you look around the contemporary landscape, people sort of is that people adopting that ethos and sort of who are influenced by that sort of stance of Beckett's? I don't know that you do, but I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think that I think there's a real emphasis on endurance in Beckett's work, and I think that makes it really important in times of catastrophe, whether that's climate change, whether that's COVID. And I find that his work, there's a whole performance history of Godot in Sarajevo in 1993, in apartheid South Africa in 1980. So you see this, you see Beckett being performed in San Quentin prison, in moments of real duress, and actually at a Beckett and the Anthropocene conference where Michael was also attending, we heard a panel by a woman in India who was talking about a performance of Waiting for Godot after, it was done in Hindi after terrible floods had sort of ravaged the region. So there is something about Beckett's work that gives us some kind of solace, some kind of sense that we can endure in difficult times. I think I got this when I was reading Endgame with my students during the first lockdown, which in France was very, very strict. And a lot of them dispersed. Some of them, you'd see them in bedrooms in LA or wherever they were. They were a very international school. But I found that reading Endgame with them I think Endgame is sometimes a hard sell with undergraduates. Some really love it, but some it takes a little bit more time to really feel one's way into the play. And I think every student understood it. Everyone had some experience of confinement, that repetitiveness, that kind of, the end is in the beginning and yet we go on, and sort of why this farce day after day. And I think there was that sense in which Beckett was an artist that helped us see our way in a really difficult and confusing moment where we were confronted with issues of life and death and repetition and boredom and stagnation, kind of all in one little packet. So
I can't go on, I must go on. Exactly. But at the same time, and this is absolutely true, but I think, of course, for Beckett, who was a committed citizen and who certainly wanted his work to be read and have an impact, but for him, I don't think he ever saw literature as directly having a direct link to world events. As I think, Amanda, it was you who said something about literature for him was not about something, but the thing itself, which always makes me think of my favorite poet, Emily Dickinson, who also she didn't want to write poetry, she wanted to write things that were in themselves objects that showed what she had seen. Do you think that have the boldness and originality of Beckett changed? I mean, in what ways have the boldness and originality of Beckett changed our ideas about what literature ought to be? Michael, I'll throw that one to you.
Well, I think along with some other writers, he's very courageous in what he produces. But I think what's unique about Beckett, and to those who are studying him, what is quite powerful is the mystery of his process. He did say that he only saw things from the inside. He couldn't tell you what it looked like from the outside. And where he was writing from within his sense of being. It was always about being, finding a form that matched it. And of course, he never could find a form that really matched what he thought the chaos of being was, or this sort of existential, ignorance we have of the entire world, of even of ourselves, and where do we stop? And he's aware that these are all social constructions, and yet he's trying to make a dramatic piece about it. That sort of thing is a challenge to an artist like Picasso. I mean, it's on a very high level of work, and I think that's why Beckett remains so powerfully relevant. My wife is an artist, and I was surprised to find out how many artists, visual artists, really know all about Beckett.
And of course, many of his closest friends were painters, and he was completely absorbed in the visual arts.
Yes.
So,
yeah,
absolutely. I think I can see that we should be sort of reaching our end. So I'm going to ask you a big question to end, which is, Beckett devoted his life to literature. He was dedicated and rigorous beyond what most of us are capable of emulating. But I wonder, and he believed in literature as something that expressed the most profound truths about the human condition. How do we emulate that kind of a commitment in the digital age? Is it possible? I thought I'd close with an easy one.
Emulate his commitment in the technological age.
Absolutely.
Well,
is it possible?
I don't know what he would do with the internet. I don't know what Beckett would do with a cell phone. Something though, because the technological interface always interested him, and he always exploited it, whether it was television or radio or, the dramatic stage. And he did it in his own way, and always very creatively, getting to the sort of showing us how we were to watch television, how you were listening to radio. So I believe he would be telling us a lot about what the extended mind is of the internet, and how identity dispersed. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
That's last tape. Exactly.
Can I echo, or do we must be me?
Please.
No, I just wanted to say, that's absolutely my sense also, Michael. I think that, Beckett, he was into radio plays, he was doing television plays, doing one film. And so I think he was someone who was really interested in media and what that does to the mind. So I do think there are kind of depths to plumb with the internet, the way it's changing our relationship to knowledge, our relationship to memory, the instantaneity of connection and communication. And I think there is a place in literature to think through that and to feel through that and to examine how that changes our experience and our emotion and our sense of being in the world. So I think how the ways are probably multiple, but there's certainly the need to try.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. This has been really interesting, and of course, I wish we had more time. But I will hand this over to Gloria Jacobs, who is the president of the Bellevue Literary Press board, and who I think has a few words to say. Thanks again.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you, Wendy, Amanda, and Michael, for a really stimulating conversation. I'm sure all of you are enjoying it as much as I am, and I just want you to know that when I'm done, you can come back, they will come back and answer some of the questions from you, the audience. So please stick around. I will be brief. I'm here to tell you something about Bellevue Literary Press tonight. And in thinking about that, I thought Beckett, Ireland, extend the metaphor somewhat, but since there's nothing I could say about Beckett that our authors haven't, I turned to another of my favorite Irish authors, Edna O'Brien. And this is what she has to say about the Irish. When anyone asks me about the Irish character, I say, look at the trees, maimed, stark, and misshapen, but ferociously tenacious. Forget about maimed, stark, and misshapen, but ferociously tenacious really, really speaks to me about Bellevue Literary Press. And I think it's a quality that Beckett would recognize as well. There were definitely times when no one thought BLP would survive, but call it karma, talent, or the absolute necessity of a press like this. We're still here, committed to the importance of the word, to the solace and challenges of wonderful writing. We're a nonprofit. We rely on donations as well as book sales. But I promise you, this is not a traditional ask. We're just so happy that you're here. Nevertheless, I will say that I hope some of you, or many of you, will consider making a donation tonight to this powerful press that publishes some of the best writing you're going to find anywhere. There should be a donate button on your screen. I hope there is. There will be a donate button in the Q&A section on the right side of your screen. And if none of those work, you can go to blpress.org, blpress.org, and make a donation there. And finally, for those of you who would prefer to send a check, you can write to us and we'll send the address. And for that, you write to Laura, Laura, at blpress.org. Thank you again for being here. Hold on, there are going to be some great questions, and I think you'll really enjoy it. And Erica will be fielding those questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gloria. And I'm just overwhelmed by the conversation that you've all been having, and I wish it could go on forever, or at least quite a bit longer, but we're going to prolong it somewhat with a number of questions. We may go over time. I don't know if anybody has to leave. You got to do what you got to do, but there are some great questions here. So I'm going to pitch them at you in order of their arrival in the Q&A. Andrew Krivak, our author of The Bear and The Sojourn, writes, I love both of these books. Thank you, Amanda and Michael. A question about Beckett. He could almost be called he could almost be called the epitome of modernism. Yet he has so much of classic literature within his work. Wounds and struggles apparent at the outset, reversals and recognitions, though often going nowhere, revealing nothing. I see that both and of the classical and the modern in each of your books. Do you employ that need to be a writer of both the classical and the modern? I was especially taken by the play of covering and revealing in Michael's Quabbin story.
Well, since Andrew mentioned my story, and thank you for the question, Andrew. I very much enjoyed your Bellevue book, I must say. Beckett wrote in one of his first essays, an essay on Joyce's work in progress, I think, beware the neatness of identifications. And so I get a little worried around the word modernism. It certainly doesn't seem to intimidate publishers because there are many books trying to define what modernism is. The most recent I'm reading is that it has something to do with the mother. And somehow, the sort of paternalism was something that was classical, and modernism is having to do with a different relationship with the mother and the notion of what family is and so on. I don't know about Beckett. I can only say that, many of the plays are rather Aristotelian. I mean, he wasn't really, there was something quite standard and classical about him. But there, of course, there's something completely new and unprecedented as well. And the thing about Beckett is you can't really put him in any category, I don't think. It's just too indeterminate.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. This is a question that's being asked by Michelle Forbes, who's an actor at the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and she's performed Beckett. So she asks, as an actor performing Beckett and working within that strict encoding of the body, playing May, for instance, counting her footsteps over and over again in footfalls, what opened for me was an immense tenderness of the self. And I was wondering what you felt about the capacity for tenderness in Beckett's work.
I'll take a first stab at this. I think this is such a beautiful way to describe a certain affect that is sometimes hard for me to put into words in Beckett. I find that it kind of reaches deep and sort of touches some emotional center that I find very powerful. That is maybe a kind of tenderness. And it's so interesting to hear you talk of tenderness, because not all of Beckett actresses, of course, as you know, felt this way. I'm thinking of the letter. I mean, of course, there's Billy Whitelaw doing Not I, but the first actress to do the actress to do Not I in the American production, Jessica Tandy. I think Beckett, she wrote to him and she said, yes, but if I speak it as fast as you want me to speak it, this is just the mouth on stage speaking a monologue as fast as it possibly can go. She said, well, no one's going to understand what I'm saying. And Beckett said, I'm not overly concerned with comprehension. What matters is that it works on the nerves of the audience. And I do find that. I think this goes back a little bit to Wendy's wonderful question about what is it about Beckett's work that is so kind of original and bold. And I think it's that stimulation of a nervous response more than any plot or story or narrative. It's really affecting something that is both nervous and emotional and highly physical also, I think. So I'm really interested to hear about your experience playing May, and I love this idea of tenderness. I find that also in Beckett's work.
I will add, as the resident Beckett lover who is also a theater obsessed, that Billie Whitelaw, who as Amanda noted, she was Beckett's favorite actress when he was alive, and she was from a very simple working class background, not a great reader, freely admitted that she sort of looked at her scripts once before she started working, but she loved Beckett, and she said she absolutely never had any trouble performing his work because she felt it. She didn't need to understand it, which I think, of course, is not true. She did understand it, but on a very deep level. And I think that's right. There's a powerful emotion and wave of feeling in Beckett. Tenderness sometimes, not always, but it's so palpable in his work.
A part of what I was going to say earlier is that because of the indeterminacy, everyone can have their own Beckett in a way, because of what you bring to it. And I happened to see Michelle Forbes's Footfalls in New York. Sarah Jane Scaife's company did 4 plays. And Michelle brought great tenderness into that role. And I've seen it done other ways, where people are more metronomic in their negotiation of the 9 steps and the turnaround, and they seem kind of, you could make someone seem captured if you were so inclined, and still be following kind of what Beckett laid out as the choreography. So I think Michelle brought tenderness to it, and I see the tenderness everywhere in Beckett. I mean, I think it's there, and I don't know if it's because what I bring to it is having been an adoptee, and I'm very aware of all the unattended children wandering through Beckett. They're unparented, they're on their own, they're mysterious creatures who take up a very interesting place in the Beckett work, and very mysterious as well.
I should add that Michelle Forbes brought her first novel to us, Ghost Moth. We were proud to be Ghost Moth's publisher. I will move on to Peter Selgin's question. It seems to me that it takes tremendous courage to be a Beckett, to resist all the temptations to conform along with all of the advantages of commercialism. The same courage applies to publishers. Who and where do you think are today's Becketts, authors who are changing or are trying to change the definition of fiction, and who is publishing them?
Well, I don't know. I did, and my wife and I read last year or 2 years ago, a book that a small press in the UK called Gallybeggar did, called Duck's Newburyport. And it's about a 700-page novel, almost one complete sentence, but there are little things that interrupt it, written by Lucy Ellmann, who, interestingly enough, her father was Richard Ellmann, who wrote the Joyce biography, the Wilde biography, and a couple of books by Yeats. I think that press is pretty daring. And I think the small press community is pretty lively and daring at all times. The issues are distribution and bookstores and getting kind of reviews and, a public attention for their author. Always a challenge.
I believe that Duck's Newburyport was published in Canada, North America, by Biblioasis.
Right.
Yeah. So it's available here. Mm-hmm. And it got a lot of attention. It was a sensation in its own way. So it's interesting that you should bring it up, Michael. Okay, next question from Gerard Cabrera. I found a copy of Murphy in my laundry room. Paperback, a 1957 Grove paperback edition. I loved it. Can anyone comment generally on this book?
Sure. Yeah, I also very much love Murphy. I find it kind of uproariously funny, and to me it's a kind of philosophical comedy, and I think that image of Murphy tying himself with scarves to the rocking chair, trying to free himself of his body so as to come alive in his mind. I find that just sort of deeply, deeply funny. And I think it's Beckett having a go at dualism and saying, what is it that we really think, we think this body and mind are completely separate. You get rid of the body and, the mind goes up in smoke as well. And he does it in such a kind of deliciously intelligent way. Yeah, and I also really love the ending of that book, the kite flying scene. That's another image in the repertoire of Beckett's literature that stays with me. So, yeah.
I agree. It's a young Beckett, not sure of where he's going exactly. It's pretty comical, and he's struggling, I think, in his personal life with attachments, shall we say? And Murphy is trying to get detached from everything, but he's just all goes wrong, and ends in Kensington Gardens in a beautiful way in London. And I'd like to reread that book. I'm sorry for the person who left it in the laundry room.
Good find.
Okay, the next and last question that we have here in the Q&A, and we're at 7 o'clock now, so thanks for staying with us. Our own Norman Locke, the author of the American Novel series. We've published, I believe, 9 books in this series to date, and there are more coming. So Norman plays a big role in the identity of Bellevue Literary Press. His question is, again and again, we see Beckett laying himself bare only to open himself to a pastoral tradition. Although I don't feel comfortable using the words narrative strategy in regard to Beckett and his work, does he indeed employ one? Are these textual beauties rhetorical and ornamental? Without them, would our experience of Beckett's work be intolerable?
Well, I think of company when it comes to that kind of description. Company is a short text, well, short, medium length, but it's probably, I once counted the paragraphs. There were about 45 paragraphs that were, typical terrain of someone crawling around on the floor and in the dark. And there were 16 or 17 paragraphs that were pastoral or nostalgic childhood memories of growing up in Dublin or Foxrock. They are, whether that's a narrative strategy or I don't know if Beckett felt, well, I have to leaven this dark thing with something that's a little more descriptive and, seemingly autobiographical. I would doubt that. I would certainly not think he's doing anything for the sake of ornament ever. But Norman is right. There is that kind of mix that really makes it all work somehow. But not all works have it.
I'm thinking here of some of the more kind of the lyrical passages in Molloy that are always very close to the surface of my memory. And I think with these passages, it's true that they're some of the most beautiful sort of texts that I've encountered. And I think, though, if you look at Beckett's descriptions of forests, the natural world, there is something often horrific about these descriptions. Not only horrific, also very beautiful, but often you find the body kind of imbricated in the environment in really sort of beautiful but also uncomfortable ways. When Molloy kind of inserts himself into Luce's garden and starts to grow, in a jar with tame roots and stems and sort of become taken over with the world. I do think Beckett's having some fun with maybe a romantic tradition that he's kind of not quite able to fully subvert or break from. And I think he's borrowing from Romanticism, even as he's lightly mocking it. He never does anything simply. You know, it's never a kind of simple relation. But I do think it's really interesting to kind of track these beauties, as you call them, and say, what are they doing in the text? When do they turn sort of horrific? When do they challenge the integrity of the body? And when can that too be a beautiful thing, this idea of us blending into nature? So I love the opportunity to think about that. Thank you. Erica, you're muted.
You're muted, Erica.
That's our final question. And tonight we have come together as a community. We've had Bellevue authors on camera. We've had wonderful readers of our books and critics on camera. We've had authors participating in the Q&A. And there's nothing that I love more than to feel a part of our community and to see all of us engage with each other. So I hope we have other opportunities to do this, even in the same room, physically, at some point. This makes me crave more hangout time with all of you. So thank you so much for doing this with us tonight, and to all who've attended. And Bellevue books are available at your favorite bookstore. You can order them through bookshop.org, and I hope you will. I hope you will continue to be our readers, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Erica.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye.